Hello everyone, welcome to Navigating India. And today we have with us Vishal Vasanthakumar, and we are going to talk about his book, The Smart and the Dumb Stories on the Politics and Purpose of Education in India. Thank you so much, Vishal, for this opportunity. So, before talking about your book, first I would like to talk about yourself. First thing is, you have a very impressive CV, right? I genuinely want to read out your whole CV from how you went from engineering to education, right now doing PhD in sociology at Cambridge, and on the way working as a political consultant, more interestingly trying to write a textbook about which we are going to talk about. But one strand that goes through your book is you reflect upon your life trajectory, how you call yourself as a product of a neoliberalism, right? So how does that come out? So tell me about your childhood and early education.
Well, I'm completely born and raised in Chennai, in a rather protected upbringing, protected upper caste upbringing of, you know, the idea that schooling, education is the only way out. There's no other privilege. Privilege doesn't exist, etc., etc. These are some of the things that were continuously reinforced to me as a child. And in school, I was a good student, but like I was more of a student who did what was told. I did not have a, I was basically a very dutiful kid. So if I was told to study, I would study and I would try to get marks, but like scoring exams have never been my forte. I have till date not been able to crack exams well. I had also in my schooling, I was exposed quite a bit to extracurricular activities, which is a very broad term, but more specifically, I did a lot of public speaking and debate, particularly Model UN and like various oratorical competitions, which kind of gave me, at that point of time, it gave me a lot of confidence. I grew up on a diet of compliments also because I was quite successful in these competitions. I used to win quite a lot of these rhetorical competitions. And when I went to college, I did a lot of Model UN also. Was very good at it and quite successful in it. So like the compliments just like kind of works in your favor, and in some cases makes you arrogant also. And I do think like when I was a lot younger, I was quite the obnoxious kid, like because I was doing all of these public facing talking things, and that kind of, I don't know, I'm not completely proud of my younger self for the things I've said and some stupid things I've done, but yeah, I did like any other Tamil boy who does take science, quote unquote science, in for their 11th and 12th. I did engineering because I did not have a single idea of what to do. Everybody, my entire peer group, were just focusing on the JEE, and all I knew was like I can't compete with that. Like exams, like I said, like I don't know what to do. I can't crack that at all. And I was like, okay, but I will do engineering from one of the private engineering colleges in Chennai. Nothing else existed in my purview. The idea of doing a liberal arts education, like no clue. What law is about, no clue. I knew I suck at drawing, I suck at biology, so medicine and all of like you'd be asking why do you think drawing matters for medicine, because at least back in the day, if you're doing biology, you had to draw birds and you had to draw plants for your in your coursework. And yeah, I'm completely challenged with that. So engineering seemed to be the only career. Like I think it remains to be the case for a lot of people who have no other inclination or idea of what to do engineering. So I did engineering. I did mechanical engineering in a private engineering college in Chennai, and I absolutely hated it. I have no qualms in saying it was a traumatic and a really, really bad educational experience, not to the fault of any of my peers over there, perhaps even not so much to the fault of the engineering college itself. It was more a reflection of the entire engineering education system that is and was prevalent in Tamil Nadu at that point of time. I learned mechanical engineering completely by memorization. Uh, there was not a single element of application, and I think it's possible to be very interested in engineering, and I do know quite a few people who are. Like it completely sucked the joy out of learning for me, and I still am. I mean, I'm kind of oldish now, but I'm still in school. I've never left school basically because I was teaching also for a while. And it just sucked the joy out of schooling, learning for me. And it's when I started teaching. I started a quote unquote education startup when I was 18, 19. I was teaching public speaking and debate to middle school and high school children. And soon, when I graduated from engineering college, which I'm really surprised that I did, uh, much better people than me I know have dropped out. I did not fail a single subject, but I just whined and moaned and cried and like angrily graduated through 4 years. And then I started teaching. I was already teaching in college. I scaled up this company where we were teaching public speaking and debate, but using public speaking and debate to teach history, philosophy, and economics. Kind of riding on the back of the fact that uh, me and my colleagues, we were all very good at Model UN. We were all very good at public speaking, and we were like, this is a skill that's necessary for a lot of people to learn, and it was taken quite well. And yeah, so that's how that was me when I was a lot younger, confused, angry, very angry, uh, obnoxious to some extent for the kind of successes I had. Again, successes within quotes for what I had within the public speaking and debates within education institutions. So you kind of start thinking like this is the world, and this is how the world is, and you're the king of it. And then there are, of course, a bunch of other things that happen that kind of bring you down, and yeah, life moves on from there.
No, that is interesting. A lot of questions because it's not only, I think, in Tamil Nadu. I'm from Andhra, and we also have this crack JEE NEET, and I was put to coaching in my fifth class summer holidays, right?
Yeah.
Joy sucked out of my life. But a few questions, right? Especially about your startup, right? You just mentioned that you try to use public debate to teach history and economics. So how do you do it? What's the pedagogy like?
So one of the things that we did was we built a game where students would come to our classrooms to play a game, which is to build a country from scratch. So over the course of 6 months, there was an entire storyline of basically it was a world building game, but you kind of played live in a classroom with 10 to 20 other students. So these students take particular positions. There's like kind of like an imposed democracy. They have to make speeches. They have to get votes. So it was a full-on world-building game where they would debate policy. But the base idea was you build a country from scratch. You are on a plot of land, and there's inhabitants, and then you kind of build society from there. And it was that was broadly the pedagogy. And so within that you kind of have to do speeches, you have to debate with your peers, you have to lobby, and all of that. So we taught the skills also. We gave our students a lot of practice, but also gave them an exposure to different concepts in history, philosophy, economics. So, for example, they had to decide if education had to be free or private. They had to decide if they wanted to be, what kind of democracy they wanted to be. They had to decide whether water should be, how they would like to supply water, things like these are all middle school and high school students. So for them also coming from a place like, at least this was a long time ago, like 8, 9 years ago. So this was at a time when social media was not as prevalent as an information source as it was now. So for the students, it was a brand new experience. And the schools don't necessarily teach. The schools teach it. At least the schools they were part of CBSE schools, with state board schools. These were not. This was not the pedagogy of choice. The pedagogy in schools were textbooks. So for them, it was a brand new experience, and it was quite well received amongst a particular elite section of students over here.
This word elite that you have used a lot, we have to talk about it. But before that, one thing you missed in your detail is the pesto business. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, yeah, like a lot of us, I really enjoy my food. I also realized later on in life that I'm quite good at cooking, and I kind of chanced. I was experimenting and kind of cracked this recipe to make like really good pesto. And this was during the pandemic also when I was working with the DMK. I was working with this political party called the DMK, and it was very demanding work. And this was, I was in rallies of like 10,000, 15,000 people when there were cases were accelerating up in a very stressful time. And I was like, okay, I need to do something to keep, to kind of de-stress from work. So I was just working out of the kitchen, just trying to do something. And then I sold it on Instagram and it became pretty popular. Many chefs recommended it on their Instagram stories and all of that. So continue. I just did it. So I didn't incorporate it or anything. But it became popular enough that I sold it in a couple of stores in Chennai. But then again, like being in food, it's a very, very labor intensive. And more importantly, making it is great. It's a lot of fun. Cleaning up afterwards is, of course, the bigger challenge. And beyond the point, I was like, yeah, I don't know. So now I do it whenever, somebody asks me for it. But it's a fairly easy recipe. I'm happy to share it.
I will surely take a note of it once the session gets over. But here I want to ask, right, from a frustrated engineering student and a pesto business, how did you ended up in social sciences?
I think I always was a lot more keenly attuned to the social sciences, even when I was in school and engineering. It's just that I suppose the kind of schools I went to and just generally the environment itself is not conducive to study the social sciences beyond a point. So I did not I don't think I mean, this was when I was a kid also. So I didn't know that there are other avenues to study the social sciences. But when I was in engineering college, model events did, for all of how messed up it is and how crazy it is, it did give me I traveled across the country, Delhi, Calcutta, Bangalore, Mumbai, Orissa, Pune, Cochin, Coimbatore, different parts of the country to model you. And you go see these various other education institutions. I was like, what? Like places like this exist, like you can study like this. So I understood, okay, there is a kind of way to channelize it. And then when you start teaching, of course, teaching is as much an art as it is a science. So you kind of start really engaging in people. And that was, I think, again, life makes sense in retrospect. So I think you should take it with a grain of salt, whatever I'm saying. But I also started understanding that when you start interacting with so many human beings, interacting with hundreds and parents and children in the hundreds and thousands over the course of 5-6 years. When you start interacting with human beings continuously, you start thinking from a social perspective. How does this interaction affect some other outcome? What are the structures that kind of affect the way people behave, etc., etc. And beyond the point, I was like, okay, I do think what I want to do is learn more. Definitely, for me, I knew I had given up on engineering by within a week from when I started. And so I was like, okay, now it took me a while to get back to learning, but I was like, I want to learn. And by this time, the company that we had built also had scaled quite a bit. We had taught more than 6,000 students. I had personally taught over 1,500, 2,000. I've lost count now, but easily around that much in schools, outside schools, across different cities. So I was like, okay, let's see. I've taught children. I have built curriculum. I have worked in building a company. Now, how does this kind of situate? How can I understand the work that I have done and the work that I want to do from a policy perspective? So I applied for, and I worked, the company also beyond the point, it was not scalable. So kind of moved away from it, and I applied for masters in public policy and education policy, and I got into Harvard for the education policy program, which was fantastic and absolutely fantastic. For however problematic and shambles the university is in today, the Graduate School of Education remains an oasis. I read definitely for those who are considering a good education in education. I do think the Graduate School of Education at Harvard is a phenomenal place to learn how to be a good human being and how to teach people or how to make people learn to be good human beings. And it was a very formative time because it was my first exposure to liberal arts. Also, so I studied the economics of education, philosophy of education, sociology of knowledge, what education does, implementation, I did a lot of courses at the Kennedy School also, where like the Masters in Public Policy happens. We interacted with multiple Nobel Prize winners, economists, anthropologists, philosophers, and I was like, damn, this is amazing. Uh, and it really grounded me, it changed me in very, very good ways, in very formative ways. Also, it's important to contextualize that until I went to Harvard, my entire experience of education was in a very kind of rigid school apparatus and then engineering college. So for me, going there and just seeing how people express their thoughts, how people structure their thinking, how do they think of themselves in the world, it like literally every day was like a punch in the face, a punch in the gut, and then you fall down and you get back up feeling a whole host of different things. And yeah, and that kind of has had, of course, a major influence on the fact that I'm doing a PhD now. It's like, I don't want to leave school. I don't want to get out of that learning environment. There's a popular joke that academics are escapists. They escape the world. For me, that's kind of true. I won't shy away from the fact that I think it gave me, the academy, broadly speaking, gave me the comfort and the space to be able to deal with myself, with my own thinking, and also deal with the fact that some people just perhaps are more comfortable in learning and thinking and not doing. And that's okay also. Because again, this neoliberalism thing that you bring up and that I write in the book also, it's kind of, the narrative has become very hegemonized towards the idea of doing. That problems need to be solved immediately. Only technical ways to solve the problem. And in fact, like after Harvard, I applied for a job in this leading education policy firm back in India. And they were like, we are not a think tank, we are a do tank. And in many other places that I applied to, they were like, we need missionaries, not mercenaries. We need doers, we don't need thinkers. There's enough thinkers in the world, we don't care about opinions. Totally fair, completely fine. But I also kind of, my time, and don't get me wrong, the course that I studied was very much a quote unquote doers course. It was for policy professionals, or rather to make you a policy professional to get back into government, into bureaucracy, into the civil sector, to implement policy programs. But also the graduate school of education also kind of gave me the space to think and understand that, you know what, there needs to be space for some thinking to happen, for some reflection to happen. It cannot be all about doing, and emphasis on all. Right? Doers are very, very important. But like, wait. I was like, wait. I don't like, and there's just a lot of churn in me at that point of time. But anyways, I did come back to India to work, to do. Soon enough, I realized I think I belong in academia more than I belong in teams, more than I belong in working with a lot of other people. I think I would much rather be by myself, and it's a very personal choice. And I think the university gives space for people like me to just do your own thing, and like that, this kind of space is important in the world also. Yeah.
I mean, here I want to ask, like, especially when it comes to this thinkers versus doers, right? Because I think there's a major dilemma every academic faces, right? We have this famous question which we try to discuss in the classes, which is the beggar issue, right? When you see a beggar on the street, right, do you just give him 10 rupees, or you see him and go back to your research think tank and measure how many beggars are there and try to solve their problem in long run? So what should be your approach, right? So what do you think about this?
And you're putting me in a spot there asking this question, and there is obviously no easy answer. It's a structural problem. Let me put it this way. There are different kinds of approaches to solving problems. One is to look at it in the long term and understand that sometimes short-term solutions are perhaps create more problems. And then there's a whole another way of thinking that you first solve the short-term needs because they are tangible, they're right there. And the structural needs kind of respond to the way short-term needs are solved. I think what I have understood is that people navigate different roles at different times in both in their lives and also based on the circumstances and the context they are in. And there is no, I would not look down one upon the other. My only contestation thus far will be that you cannot hegemonize the narrative of just doing. Right? Because it oftentimes, and it's been the case, what we have seen in the last 50 to 70 years across sectors, across disciplines, is that you solve one problem, inadvertently you cause a bunch of other problems. This is an example that was taught to me in policy school, where in the country of Gabon, in Africa, women had to walk around 5 to 7 kilometers every day to collect a pot of water. And the World Bank and a bunch of people like, wait, that's inhumane, etc., etc. They went and kind of created, they bought pipe water to a bunch of settlements. 1 year later, they saw that people in the domestic violence inside that settlement increased by around 50%. And this was because of the misogynistic and very patriarchal society that these women were in. That 10 to 15 kilometer walk every day was them getting out of the house and kind of engaging with other women folks, spending 3 to 4 hours of the day outside where they have their own space. And now they were confined to their homes. And being confined to their homes, the men were attacking. So they solved the water problem, and inadvertently, they did not know, and definitely I won't doubt the intention of World Bank people or like all of these small policy walks and bringing pipe water connection to these houses. But yeah, this happened. So like oftentimes we need to really sometimes we need to really consider not just long-term effects, but the structural context in which social problems are there, and sometimes you need to solve problems then and there. Different people do it in different ways. I don't look down upon either one of those ways, and I don't think taking a structural long-term view should also, like, some people can take structural long-term views, and that's also important. Is the only claim I would.
No, I think I want to further probe you on this question, which is, especially this happens when we talk about unemployment, right? So why is an individual unemployed, right? And some students would answer saying because he don't want to get employed, right? And we can go talking about the larger structural issues within the economy. So what can take the prudence? That's the first question. And second question, because you have talked about the World Bank interventions into Africa, is it something to do with not understanding the South, right? Do we need more probing when we try to implement policies? Because we all know how much the mess the aid politics has created in the global South. So
I need to clarify that I'm not a professional or an expert in these things. I can contextualize your question with what I've written in the book. Yeah, again, like these unemployment questions are much larger than one particular thing. Well, there is a glaring paradox, and I will refer from what I've written in my book because I really don't have much other material to refer to. Is that there's a glaring paradox in Indian education today, where at this particular time in 2024, we are seeing universal access to primary education, or perhaps universal access to education. We are seeing 100% gross enrollment ratio in primary schools across the country. Maybe like 1 or 2% here or there, but like one of the most common experiences that an Indian has today is school education. Almost everyone is going to school. And some states like Tamil Nadu is having like gross enrollment ratio of 105, 106%, which means that even those who didn't go to school, didn't get access to school, are now able to at least go to primary school. So, and also you have a kind of a booming higher education sector. The NEP wants to increase gross enrollment ratio to 50%. So basically, there is a point in time where like a lot of people are getting access to education, and also you're seeing unemployment. And like these are hundreds and thousands and millions of youth being unemployed. There's this paradox over there. You have employers who are like the people that these people don't have the skills that are necessary for our jobs, and then you also have a lot of people coming out with degrees and with credentials. So clearly there is a structural problem. And the structural problem needs to be understood not just from a policy perspective, it needs to be understood from a societal perspective, from a sociological, political, and economic perspective. These are programmatic problems. These are not technical problems. One. The other thing with respect to how people understand the global south, I think what you're referring to, is kind of symbolic to how it's not just a global north versus global south problem. It is a group of people who think they have the credentials and are not very locally rooted. And actually, it's not even that. I would say that there is a hierarchy of value associated with people who have particular degrees from particular places in the world, me included. And I'm not saying I'm like that, but I'm saying from where I have studied and where I am studying, who think that they do know a little bit more than what's on the ground. The credential, the signal of a particular degree sometimes is valued more than knowledge from the ground. And there is well, it's very much possible and it happens in multiple situations. It's horrible of me to generalize, but there is in some cases, and perhaps in many cases, a lack of communication between people who have access to formal knowledge and theories made by very bright minds, and also knowledge that comes from the ground that is deeply rooted in many problems of the ground. And I have learned the hard way that, to just put it simply, I think this one small anecdote answers kind of all your questions over here. Many places where I travel to, especially when I work with the Department of School Education and with the DMK, if I went anywhere and said I studied in Harvard, the first question to me would be is, where is Harvard or what is Harvard? Right. So I think that's the starting point. You need places like Harvard matter to some people. It does not matter to a whole host of people. Like many people I have spoken to have no idea what the hell that is. And that's important. And there's that mismatch coming from there. And we need to be aware of it.
Right. So when you're reflecting about this, right, about education attainments, right, though we have enrollment ratio, right, it's not leading to higher employment outcomes, right? But further points that you mentioned in your work, because we started talking about it, is how education runs, the politics of education runs to several intersections, right? You already talked about which university you're coming from, Indian university or from abroad, right? And I've literally seen some jobs announcing for grade A, right? This should be some foreign university, and grade B, and each one will get a different salary, right? And education runs through several intersections, right? You have explored private, public, male, female, upper class, urban, rural, right? All these intersections, right? Now, I would like to explore each intersection. I will try to start with private versus public, right? And how do you look at it, right? Is it true that private education outcomes are better, and the students who are educated in private sector do well in life than in public sector in India?
So again, this is a broad question, and my answer to it also has to be kind of broad. The one thing important to understand is that we need to take some realities some structural realities in context. When you aggregated, the private school system in India is the third largest school system in the world after China and India's public school system, right? Around 51, maybe the number's not at the top of my head, but more than 50% of Indian children go to private schools today. And private schooling, understood in India, has a completely different connotation than public schooling understood abroad. In the West, where I've studied in the UK and the US, private schooling is only for the top elite, and the fees go up to many private schools go have fees of like $50,000, $60,000 a year, right? So obviously, because of that kind of fee mechanism, people self-select and there's a very specific group of children and learners who get into that school. Private schooling in India varies from 5,000 rupees a year to 4 or 5 lakhs a year. Right? That is the entire gamut of private schools in India. So we are looking at a deeply fractured and a spectrum of schooling schooling experiences, which we are classifying under one blanket term as private school. Right? Which is why so now another important aspect to understand is why has there been such an expansion of private schooling in India? One important thing to understand over here is that like around the 80s or the 90s, it was around 70 to 80% of all kids in India were going to public school. And now the number of children going to public school has dropped quite significantly. Right? Now, why is that? One logical answer is that people have voted with their feet. People have seen that, or people have decided, I am no judge of it, but people have decided that public schooling is not working for them, so they move to private schools. Now, if you take, again, aggregated reports like the Central Square Foundation's State of Private Schools report, they have found that the learning outcomes in private schools is almost as bad as it is in public schools. Of course, you have pockets of excellence. You have your elite private schools where your children are doing really, really well. You have, and then again, you disaggregate that amongst like caste groups or class groups. You will find that upper caste Hindu children are just like their learning levels are at par with like Finland and Norway and Japan. And Muslim children in India, learning outcomes are as poor as Afghanistan or different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's very difficult to. So the one of the major problems has been to kind of aggregate all of these understandings of schooling under broad umbrella terms. In every, like, education experiences significantly vary across, and it significantly varies depending on your socioeconomic location and geographic location. What I've tried to kind of show in the book is how people's caste, class, gender affects your education experience and affects your life outcomes also. So when we say private schooling, public schooling, we need to understand the heterogeneity of experiences that are there within these very terms also. Even within a 2-kilometer radius, your education experience can be significantly different. Your life outcome can be significantly different. And we are still, and this is the thing, the idea of a school that, like, if you, this is one of the main claims of my book also, that if you send the child to school, 12 to 15 years later, they will come out as a finished product. That is unfortunately the very technical, in some sense, a neoliberal privatized understanding of schooling. Right? There is so much that happens inside the school. There's so much that happens outside the school. Your identity, your location, all of it plays major roles in your experience. So the notion that the school is the provider and the school gives you the promise of equality of opportunity in itself is deeply flawed. So we have taken what the school stands for as we have taken it for granted deeply. Like, so the argument that is being made across the world, like, I have gone to school, you have gone to school, somebody else has also gone to school, so we are all the same. But that is absolutely not true, because our schooling experiences and education experiences, and I make a distinction between the two, because schooling is not just education alone. There are multiple sides of education: the family, caste, class, gender, your geographical location, your religious affiliations, etc., etc. They're all sides of education as well. And I kind of point to particular sides of education in my book. These all play significant roles, and therefore equality of opportunity is, the school is not, that the promise of the civic institution of a school was to provide equality of opportunity, or at least to neutralize particular disadvantages. Neither of those promises are being fulfilled. So the idea is to place education and schooling back within a political discourse and take it away from the hegemony of a policy discourse. So that's the broad understanding of it. So any binary distinction that we make, public, private, urban, rural, upper caste, lower caste, all of it has such heterogeneity of experiences within them that what we are doing by kind of looking at these issues in these ways, we are only looking to essentialize problems. And it's time to bring context back and time to bring the discourse back into a democratic political dialogue. Because again, for better or for worse, I don't know, the policy discourse is essentializing a lot of people. It is making children into isolated statistical bodies, uh, whose experiences are like whose school experiences or education experiences are hermeneutically sealed from uh, from the rest of society. But that's not true. Children are in school 8 hours a day and then spend 16 hours a day outside. So there's a whole host of things that are happening that's not taken into context or consideration at all. And like that's just something I'm trying to point out in the book as well.
Right. And now that you have also spoken about what's happening outside the school, right? And you mentioned a little bit about the family, right? Family, as in your book also, you write how family is a site of contestation. And so how does family as the factor influences the child education, right?
No, so well, for a very long time, formals, the idea, I mean, first of the idea of a formal education system through schooling or university and all of that is a very recent concept. Perhaps 100, 150 years old, designed to serve the needs of colonial apparatus and more recently of the nation state. Until then, where did children learn? Children, or where did people learn? People learned at home. People learned in religious institutions, all of which had major elements of the family. So the family is perhaps as important a site of education as any other site in itself. We don't. The problem is we take it for granted, and again, the idea of a family in itself is so rooted in cultural context, in cultural differences. So it's very difficult to again essentialize it as like one specific or broad category. I try to point out in the book, for example, in some of the chapters of the book, for example, um, the first chapter I talk about how some children need to stop saying children. Some people use education as a way to get out of marriage, child marriage, and some people had to get married because of education, right? Both these places, the familial pressure of getting married, because one of the things that like my interlocutors told me, like they're pulling their girl children out of school by the age of 13 or 14, because their notion was if the girl studies more, ladki haath se chut jaye, or the title of the chapter is the girl will get away. Right now, that is as important a structural constraint in education as anything else. So the family is very much a site of education everywhere. Like like depending on what your mother's nutritional levels are, how the mother's pregnancy was, what your nutritional outcomes are in the first 1,000 days of your life, uh, how your family is situated within socioeconomic context, play the biggest role in affecting your educational outcomes and thereby your life chances. So we all have vastly different experiences of all of this, most of which is not in our control. You don't choose the mother to which you're born. You don't choose how your mother's pregnancy is. You don't choose your nutritional outcomes indicators over the first 1,000 days of your life. So yeah, family plays in every single way a major role. Family also means caste and class and gender. Your gender biases, caste affiliations, caste understanding, identifications, all of it play a major role. If you are in a caste-aware, reflective family, you will perhaps grow up being reflective of your privilege. If you are in a if you're in a family that has very strong caste ties, you're most likely going to grow up to be casteist. And that forms it forms a major part in your life as much as your 12th standard certificate or your undergraduate credentials do, because that is also forming your networks. That's also forming opportunities. It is giving you access to capital, etc., etc. So all of these are deeply connected. Everything is implicated with the other, and we need to understand all of these things holistically and not as isolated statistical processes where, like, if you toggle one input, the output would be different.
Well, one thing you talked about is the factor of the privilege, right? And the types of household we are coming from. But asking a bit more broader question, right? You are like an outsider to many of these participants because you also write about a situation that you have faced in Tamil Nadu when you are on an election campaign, right? Where our one woman from an audience got up and shouted at the legislator you are working with as a political consultant that what will the government doing, we got educated, we are not getting jobs. And when you again went to speak to her, she told about you can speak English, so you anyway have better outcome than me, right? So now this is a very positionality is a very structural issue. As how while writing your book you were conscious about this factor of your position?
Of course, it's the one question that keeps me up at night for good reason, and I think it's very important for people to consider their positionality. This was it is a. I was very aware of the fact that I was an upper caste, fair-skinned, English-educated man in many of these contexts, and oftentimes you really wonder what you're doing in these kind of projects. Are you extracting information and imaginations from people for your own benefit? And yes, of course, this book is benefiting me. It is many qualitative social science projects tend to be self-serving. So the important question I had to grapple with multiple times is, who are you in this context and how do you deal with it? And I understood multiple things through my travels for this book and also for my PhD right now. Is A, if you are not treating the people you're interacting with as research subjects and objects, and that is evident, people are very happy to talk to you. If you are not having an extractivist approach and making yourself so self-important, people are very, very happy to talk to you. All the characters in my book were more than happy to talk to me. And in fact, the person M, who I mentioned in the second chapter of the book, who took me around Manipur, he in fact reached out. Like, I had put a post on Facebook. Until then we had no idea who we were to each other. He took me around. I was in Manipur with him for weeks. He was we became very close friends. I met him yesterday after 4 years. Right? It really depends on the empathy and the compassion with which you approach your interlocutors who are not research objects or subjects, but you understand them to be serious intellectual practitioners, each of whom have agency, each of whom are exercising their own will on the world, and who are navigating the obstacles and challenges in their lives the way they can. And you are understanding them for that. You are not understanding them for much more or much less. That empathy and compassion is a skill that is cultivated based on multiple interaction, and most importantly, on the very firm principle that people are not a means to an end. People are an end unto themselves, and people should be understood and approached as them. There is nothing wrong in going and talking to people and asking them questions, but the context in which you're asking them really matters, and when you're vulnerable enough to reflect with them. So I'm asking them a question and they are answering something. Let's say it's a difficult question. They're answering that. I reflect back with them on my positionality, on my vulnerabilities, and not trivialize or patronize them in that matter. And most importantly, to not extract information, but think of them as a serious intellectual practitioner. Now, the other part of it is, how do you, these are all, a lot of the questions I asked are based on experience. They're very experientially driven ideas also. And many times the ideas come later. Many times you go with a theoretical understanding and then you ask them that question as well. The clear part of that is to understand that in some cases you're an equal, in some cases you're not. And if you're depicting their experience in an authentic manner, I may be severely mistaken in the way I have depicted people, but is it authentic? Is it empathetic? Is it compassionate? If yes, there is there is some grounds to the work that you've done. And these are people who are voluntarily sharing information. I'm not shutting them up in a room and like torturing them to get this. Neither am I paying them to give me the information that I want. For example, there's a chapter in my book called A Good Mother, which was basically about how do mothers of children with autism and ADHD navigate the world now. And I reached out to some of these mothers, and they spoke what was supposed to be 30-40 minute interviews. Each interview, and I did many, each interview went on for at least 1.5 to 2 hours. Many of these interviews were in where these people were in tears. These mothers were in tears. And at the end of it, they're telling me like nobody has ever listened to my problems before. Nobody has ever heard me out. And thank you for just giving me a space to talk. And in that process of just listening, they're sharing very, very intimate details of their lives, especially of their personal lives. I did not ask for it. They are sharing it because people just want to be heard sometimes. And it's important to be aware of that. And again, I will firmly emphasize on the empathy and the compassion. Positionality is very important when you know that you are in a position of power to be able to extract. And that it's a difficult place to justify that. I'm not saying extraction is completely okay. If people are willing to share and you're empathetic and compassionate, and then in your writing, if that depiction is relatively authentic, you're never going to be able, like, also comes with the knowledge that I'm never going to be able to be in their shoes because I come from a very different place. Neither do they want me to be in their shoes. Different people will go on, we lead different lives, and then we have a multitude of experiences. That's all right. Are we able to do this in a fairly just manner? If yes, then these voices deserve to be heard. And the most important thing I felt as a writer, and this was thanks to my education at Harvard and like reading quite a lot of narrative nonfiction and continuously thinking about the ethics of positionality and the ethics of writing this, is that if trying to find the right words for this, it is very much possible to depict these stories, and do not write if you think you cannot do justice to these stories. It is much better off to not write things for your own benefit if you think the characters in the story, especially in narrative nonfiction and in academic social sciences, if you're not going to be able to do justice to the people who you have been interacting with on the page, then do not engage with that topic. There are so many chapters, there are so many stories that did not feature the book for this reason. It's like, am I doing justice to them on the page? Can I do justice to them in life is a whole different question. Perhaps I can't. I'm not like a messenger of justice in that sense. But in my position as a writer, am I doing justice to them on the page? If yes, go ahead and write authentically with empathy and compassion. If no, do not. Do not look to extract, do not look to objectify, do not look to essentialize. I learned that was a very good learning for me, and I'm taking that forward in my work also.
That's deeply reflective, and I'm very appreciative of that because especially scholars, right? They want to put out everything they have seen on the paper, right? But it is, as you have pointed out, very important to reflect upon whether we are being authentic, right? And we are doing justice to our stories. Now, one thing you have mentioned in your conversation is about the narrative nonfiction, right? And I think that's perhaps a field which is currently booming in India in terms of the kind of literature, right? Narrative nonfiction. So tell us, what is this narrative nonfiction and how did you get inclined to this? And why do you take it as a method to write this particular work?
Sure. So narrative nonfiction was a genre that came up in the US around the 1960s and the 1970s. It was also a movement called New Journalism. It goes by other names also, creative nonfiction, etc., etc. Basically, the idea of this genre, again, I'm paraphrasing a lot of history of this genre, was that reporting and journalism for a very long time was very fact-based. It was just reported. 15 centimeters of rain happened in this district, written in passive voice, etc., etc. It was a statement of facts of things that happen. And of course, there is so much lost in context. There's so much subjectivity in objective reporting. So slowly, these, people started understanding, and people started writing. People started reporting in journalism using literary devices, metaphors, similes, allegories, etc., and a whole host of other literary devices also. And soon this picked up because you're basically telling true stories, but using literary devices. So it makes the story engaging, and also kind of dissolved the idea, kind of made truth, fiction and non-fiction, truth and non-truth. It removed it from the binaries and put it, I suppose, in my opinion, back where it should be, within a very murky gray understanding of it. And in India, there has been very good non-fiction writing, narrative non-fiction writing for a while. The thing is, English language, my exposure to it has been English language writing. I don't know if it's there in regional languages as much. Was that there's a lot of good narrative non-fiction, but this was not there in education. You had phenomenal authors. One of my biggest inspirations, Samat Subramanian, who wrote on how fish and culture intersect in one of his books called Following Fish. He's written a portrait of post-Civil War Sri Lanka. You had you had a whole host of non-fiction writers, not just in India but outside India, also in the US. You had Joan Didion, who was was not just a mirror to American society, but really captured the mood and the pulse of, in one of her books, of the 60s and 70s San Francisco, this entire hippie culture. Well, there's one thing you can write about it statistically, but to also capture a whole feeling and an emotion of it. Very powerful, and stories do evoke that. All of this writing was rather evocative and not, the idea was not necessarily to convince. It was to evoke feelings and understandings and emotions. All that. I was like, this is great. And I was very taken to it as a child, very taken to it when I was very young. And I was like, why is this not there in education? Also, I saw that most of the writing about education in India was either something about policy or happy stories, happy positive stories of how education is so beneficial. Oh, look at this exceptionalistic story of how this poor child from this small little village in this part of India now is at this position only because of education. Yay. I was like, great, but there is a much bigger world to this. It's not about making people happy. So my book is actually, I would think of my book as a rather dark book. It's very it doesn't make people happy. It doesn't make people feel good. And I was like, that's an avocation also, and it's not just an avocation, it's a provocation as well, and that I figured was important. So these were some of the motivations for it, but of course translating it into this kind of work took a very long time. Also because I had to continuously reflect on who I am and what I am on the field, and then who I am and what I am on the page. Until last year, the editorial process got done, I wasn't very clear. I think from the response I've got for the book, which has thankfully been, to my surprise also, I must be honest, very positive for its depictions, for the portrayals of characters and all of that. I was like, I suppose, I do think this gap in education and journalism was a significant one, and I think it was an important gap to fill. And mine is an attempt to paint a portrait of what education does and whose needs are served by it, who benefits from it. Important questions which I suppose people had not engaged with seriously for a while.
What are some of your inspirations? You have already mentioned Saman Subramanian. What else? What are the
So quite a lot actually. There's a lot of narrative nonfiction that I had read in different parts of it. Academic nonfiction. I wouldn't place one or two specific inspirations. There's this book called slightly now fairly criticized book for good reason, also called Beyond the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo, which is kind of like a ethnography of Dharavi. But she's this white woman writing about it. Did not necessarily anonymize her interlocutors and all of that. But when I read it back then, I was like, well, somebody's done this very interestingly, pretty well. But my biggest inspirations was definitely Saman Subramaniam, Joanne Didion. There's also there's this book called The Empire of Pain, which is about the Sackler dynasty and how they got America addicted on painkillers. I think the author's name is Patrick Keller. So some inspirations. Basically, when I was writing, I was also studying how they wrote. I was not just following like one aspect of when you're trying to be a writer, the way you read changes quite a lot. You read not just to learn and understand, but you read to extract as well. And I'm pretty sure writers who write these kind of work, they know it also. So you understand techniques, you understand the way stories are constructed, you understand that many places people make meaning retrospectively. The idea of rational choice, that people are making rational choice one after the other, as much as it is true, it is quite evident, for at least for me, from my time having traveled to more than 19, 20 states in the country, interacting in different educational contexts, that many a times people just make choices and then make meaning and sense of it a lot later. And that's how we write also. And so you kind of start reading not just to learn and understand, but you read extractively. How did this author construct this? How can I extract this technique and apply it to my context? One of my another major influence, I very randomly chanced upon this book, and I really enjoyed discovering books and more than I enjoy people recommending books to me, and I enjoy going to a bookshop and something coming to me over there. I found this book in Blossoms in Bangalore. The only copy that was left, it was called, it was by this author called Ryszard Kapuscinski. It was about him traveling in Africa for 40 years. He's called the greatest witness in the world. I think it's After the Shadow of the Sun or something like that. I'll find out. I'll tell you what it is. But yeah, it was about him traveling in Africa for 40 years and kind of being in perhaps all the conflicts that Africa has seen from the 1960s to the 2000s, contracting malaria multiple times. It was when I read it, it was like, damn, I've never read such a depiction of Africa before. Also important he contextualizes it, and it's also important for us to contextualize that he's a Polish white man, right? He's a Polish journalist who's also been in who's been under Stalinist Soviet regimes, seen the downfall of the Soviet Union, etc., etc. So he's called the greatest. He's also witnessed all the democratic revolutions, or rather the anti-democratic revolutions in South America. He writes about all of this, and I was reading it and it's like, damn, I'm not a witness like that, and I'm very afraid to put myself in conflict zones, in conflict situations like he has. But I understood. I read and reread all of his books. It has this book called Imperium also. Seeing how people have written this kind of work. Another book I would recommend is this book called Secondhand Time by this author called Svetlana Alexievich. It's it's basically oral histories of people who watched the Soviet Union collapse. And so I understood that there are very real stories here. And people's stories are very important. Their aspirations are very important because it's the driving force of society. People are not statistical bodies. People are aggregated into numbers to solve problems at an aggregated level. That's what policy does, and policy does that well. And many problems have been solved that way, but many other unintended problems have been created that way. And somebody needs to document these issues, and a good bunch of people need to document these issues, not just one or two people. And there are different roles we can take based on our skills and capacities. May sound like a justification for many sort of caste hierarchies, but I do think that if people are able to document stories and depict human beings for who they are and what they want to be, it should be done. Because it goes back to one of the first questions you asked, and it's an important question I think that you asked of short-term problems, long-term problems, and my answer back then and this answer are very similar, is that you like again on aggregation you can solve problems, you will have unintended consequences, all of which are driven by human aspirations, human needs, human stories. So we need the depiction and documentation of these stories as well. Those who can do solve problems, those who can think about problems. Neither one of it should not be hyper prioritized over the other. The discourse should not be hegemonized. We need communication across these disciplines. The statistics give structure to the stories, and the stories give context to the statistics. They don't exist in isolated manners. And this is again where I think to again bring your point back about neoliberalism, this is again one of the major faults of it. Yes, perhaps neoliberalism brought many hundreds of millions out of poverty. It reduced many people to statistics, primarily because we started seeing solutions to problems as technical solutions, and the politics of it was very much looked down upon. It happens in day-to-day conversations today. Neoliberalism is not just a comment on capitalism or communism, that like privatization of multiple sectors of the nation should be like privatization is better than the state holding power. It's not necessarily also just like a valorization of corporate monopoly. It's also privatization of the mind, that we all think of ourselves as economic entrepreneurs who are all capable of solving our own problems. And if we fail, quote unquote, fail in life, it's our own fault, right? And this has effects on how we understand meritocracy. And then you see assertions towards, for and against meritocracy in various different contexts in various parts of the world. All of these things are very much interconnected. And I think that this is important, but like often neglected point, which I've tried to sort of just point out.
Now there are too many questions, but before we again speak about your book, I would like to ask some trivial questions because you have brought them up, right? What's your best bookshop in Bangalore?
Best bookshop in Bangalore.
Apart from, is it Blossoms or Bookworm more specifically? I'm more inclined to later.
I've been too much to Bookworm, to be honest, but I really like Champaka.
Oh, yes. That's the bookshop. Second question, right? It's about especially authors trying to extract, right? Paperback or hardcover?
Oh,
Or Kindle?
I would get into trouble for this, but this is not an author's choice. The hardback, paperback is a publisher's choice based on what they think the viability of a book is in the market. The thing is with hardbacks are cost marginally more, but also have a premium feel to it. So you're justified in charging more for it, whereas paperbacks do. So it really depends on. I didn't have a say if this was going to be a hardback or paperback.
So what's your choice? So do you prefer to read paperbacks or hardbacks?
I prefer what's inside the book. It really doesn't matter whether it's paperback or a hardback.
That's genuinely an answer I have never heard before on this question. Okay. So do you write on your books with pen?
I'm a significant note taker. I'm a highlighter. My method of reading is this is actually why I often prefer reading on my screen, on my laptop, because when I read PDFs on laptop, I highlight past sections, I write comments on the end, and then I also annotate it. I extract it, and it's kind of there in like one entire note bank of sorts. And that helps me in my writing, because my writing in research, as you may know, it requires a lot of you taking snippets from this person said this citation. I drank water today. I don't know, Ravikant 2018, something. So you have to like quote a lot of people and cite a lot of people, obviously for good reason. So I take copious amounts of notes on that also. But having said that, I do some books that I read are very intentionally not note based because I just want to experience the book. There are some things like I'm reading a book now called Seven. Is by this person called Thomas Dubois. Where I read slightly problematic characters because I really enjoy the tension. This is a, a Midwest American historian who's lived in China for 40 years and writes about Chinese food history. He's done a broad sweep 40 years of Chinese food history, 5,000 years of Chinese food history in like 400, 500 pages across 7 banquets that he's eaten. So at least I don't want to take notes for this kind of book. I want to, I just want to enjoy it. I want to see what it evokes in me. And like, I'll make notes of like, I make kind of mental, emotional notes of how it made me feel or like what I thought about it. But I won't like note this line in this particular page thinking like, okay, yeah, I'll refer to this later. Some books I read like that.
Now that's where I want to talk about this English education, right? You also a little bit talk about. I mean, I want to connect this with your idea of participating in culturals, right? You speak about how that is in itself a very involves a kind of politics of humiliation, if I can use that phrase of yours there. So how does this matter? Like, first thing is why is it so important to speak in English? I mean, perfect English, the poised one, and the larger question of the culturals and education outcomes. So, what are your views on that?
No, this is, let me put it this way. Uh, English is, I'm not going to comment on the benefits of the pros or cons of studying English. These are educational strategies and educational choices that people make. And English is privileged. People who study English are privileged, not financially or stuff like that. It is a language of privilege to some extent. And let me answer this in a much broader way. Don't quote me on just this. It's important to understand why studying English is so important and particularly contextualize this within the middle class or who we understand the middle class in India to be. And I comment about this in the conclusion of my book also. And it's a major part of my PhD as to who is the middle class in India and what do they do. Right? If you were to take particular statistics if you were to take particular scholars and how they understand the middle class, it varies wildly. You have numbers depending on the way you define the middle class based on income consumption, based on parameters you set, whether the family is earning 1 lakh, 2 lakh, 3 lakh, whatever. Who is the middle class? So the way numbers vary from as much as 100 million to 400 million, right? And that's supposedly the middle class in India. And this middle class is fractured massively in terms of caste, right? So you have Tamil Brahmins, for example, who a bunch of anthropologists have documented as a middle class caste, despite Tamil Brahmins being on the top of the caste hierarchy. And you also have a growing Dalit middle class over the last 20, 30 years, right? So, and you also, and then basically the middle class comprises of almost all castes because nobody wants to say that I am very rich. Nobody wants to have the indignity of being seen as this super rich, posh person. And nobody wants the indignity of being a poor person. So people who earn 70,000, 80,000 a year and Narayan Murthy both identify as middle class. Right? So this middle class is this universal ubiquitous term because the middle class kind of, as Satish Deshpande says, it articulates the hegemony of a particular bloc, of the ruling bloc. And also what being the middle class does is it's an aspirational identity. Like I said, somebody who's actually very poor, whose family earns perhaps 7,000, 8,000 a month, and Narayan Murthy, a billionaire, both identify as middle class because it's aspiration. It is a morally acceptable position to be. And whoever is actually in this, who's dominant within the middle class, are able to corner discourses based of aspiration. And English has become, and English is closely tied to the middle class, and English is aspiration. It's important to understand that. For many reasons, regional languages have not been aspirational. And places from where I come from, like Tamil Nadu, the Tamil language is prioritized. It's privileged by state policy. For example, now in response to the NEP, second language in Tamil is compulsory for every student going to any kind of school. Right? So Tamil is privileged as a language in state policy, but is it aspirational? I don't have an answer to that question. Is English aspirational? I would very much say yes. Right? Similarly, with any other regional language in India or any regional language in the world. So English has become a link language and to different things. And people are also seeing that quote unquote jobs that serve middle class values, whatever the hell that means, are based on English, service sector jobs, right? Your entire, I suppose you mentioned you're in Bangalore, right? Bangalore exemplifies this significantly. Most of the aspirational jobs are inside AC offices, which require you speaking in English, perhaps to clients abroad. And this is why I contextualize in my book about globalization and neoliberalism. The benefits of globalization have been cornered by very few, most of whom are privileged enough to have quality of education based on specific languages. And all of this is bundled into a whole host of factors. And I think it's structurally important to kind of separate all of this. This is not an isolated incident. In China also, English is aspirational. English is understood in, like, English is a middle class kind of notion and creation. If you look at, and I may be kind of brushing the strokes too broadly over here, but if you look at the elite in India, and again, the elite is such a loaded term, the landed elite, the ruling political class, very few of them are very conversant in English. The landed political elite are not completely conversant in English. All the way from the prime ministers to multiple chief ministers, they are rooted in their regional language, or rooted in the language that they are most comfortable in speaking. Like, for example, Stalin was in Delhi yesterday, the chief minister of Tamil Nadu was in Delhi yesterday, and people are making fun of him because a Tamil journalist asked him to speak in English, and he either inadvertently or intentionally made a grammatical error. Right? So, and these guys they own it. They're okay with it. Because, again, English, by virtue of being an aspirational middle class category, becomes a form of elite capture. Whereas regional languages, language is not a way of elite capture, but like other forms become a form of elite capture for, people who occupy other roles in society. So yeah, that structural sociological understanding, I suppose, is very important in understanding why English is privileged like this. And because English is an aspirational language, the social life of this language has been created and is continuously being maneuvered by a middle class, which is deeply, deeply self-fractured on the basis of caste. And so I will, leave it at that. I would also like to point out that there are multiple studies understanding all of this. So I'm paraphrasing in multiple ways, also bringing in, I think, but there is a whole host of studies. If you just go on Google Scholar and search, you will find so many people having done phenomenal work on this as well.
What about the culturals, right? The culturals as a phenomenon of creating inequalities and ladders of talent.
Yeah. So I think it's important for who's listening, we explain what these culturals are. The way what I write as culturals is this kind of these kind of activities and competitions that happen. I don't know for sure if it happens in the north, but I know for a fact that in southern schools and southern colleges, there are these big events, big competitions of multiple things like oratorical, dance, music, etc., which like institutions put together as extracurricular festivals. And now within this, I kind of in my book, I document particular schools in Chennai which have these competitions, and I document the mechanisms through which students of particular private schools corner uh, what is understood as success and not, based on how they set the rules of competition in the schools, right? So yeah, the if you what I document is, if you are good like me, if you're good in English, if you have the confidence to go on stage and speak in front of groups of 300, 500, sometimes even 1,000 people, and you perform extempo without much preparation on topics like idli or sambar, which is better, and you are given a split second to start talking for 3 minutes, or even topics like Betty or Veronica, or topics like uh, Drake or Kendrick Lamar, right? These are the topics that are kind of like, one, giving you one very specific example. Now, who has access to understanding Drake versus Kendrick Lamar kind of thing, or like I don't know, like references from American pop culture or English pop culture. Now, these are rules. Like, and I my experience of taking part in these events, and also having interviewed recent participants. If anybody performed, for example, in Chennai in Tamil, if in an English speaking, in a competition, in an oratorical competition, if somebody spoke in Tamil, they're disqualified, right? And yeah, but like, they may be phenomenal orators in Tamil, and trust me, Tamil Nadu has phenomenal Tamil orators. And this is a tradition and aesthetic that it's a part of public life, and it's a part of the ethos of a very large group of people. If you speak in Tamil, you're out, because Tamil is considered local, and like they say, like, I've seen judges and teachers say they're speaking locally. That is not what we do here. So you see that, like, you're basically, what I theorize also, and I'm doing this in my PhD, is how particular forms of capital are privileged in school, and how one form of capital converts to another. Now, you being able to speak good English is from there's a sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about how there's conversion of capital. So here, if you have economic capital, you're able to go to particular good schools, quote unquote good schools. Now you're able to convert this economic capital into cultural capital here, which is a proxy for speaking good English. And you're winning these competitions because you're speaking good English. And then this converts into social capital, which is basically the networks you form, and then that kind of affects your opportunities and all of that. It's this kind of work has been contextualized multiple ways, and by multiple people across the world. But yeah, there is like you said, the ladder of talents, or this hierarchy that's given, is basically a form of capital conversion from one, either economic, social, cultural, caste, class capital. It all converts one another to improve your outcomes. And the problematic part, I mean, like, one argument is that everybody does it. Fine. The problematic part is when people start assuming that this is merit, or this is meritocracy, and do not recognize the privilege that they come from, and do not recognize the mechanisms that they themselves have used to afford their chances. That's, I suppose, that's very important, and that's what I try to do in that chapter.
No, again, I want to further probe on this English question. There's a lot of questions. I've been reading this series of articles in Swaddle by Ravikant Kishana, right, where he talks about dating like a savannah, teaching like a savannah, and which especially talks, especially after suicides, high suicides we are seeing in IITs, right? Which actually brings the question of English and meritocracy and affirmative action into the picture, right? For example, especially in one of his pieces, he talks about how when they go to colleges, the people who got through affirmative action cannot actually ask doubts to the teachers, right? And casually interact with them, right? And only privileged who had access to media and a kind of family social capital are better position to answer these, right? When I joined university, my bachelor's, when I tried to join an organization here, the topic I was given was pineapple on pizza or not, right? I mean, I don't have a clue about it. So how do we navigate through this idea of meritocracy, education, and the affirmative action?
I think there is a rather simple understanding over here, and this is again, okay, so first up, it is vital to understand that the promise of the school as the provider of equality of opportunity is not happening. It is not, the promise has not been kept, not because of the way particular schools function, but because of the very structural context in which schools operate. Right. So if we understand that equality of opportunity in schooling itself does not exist, equality of opportunity in higher education would not exist. Right? You have 60%, and this is not a stat I'm making up, and a lot of people have refuted me with this, like because the statistic bothers the hell out of people, because it fundamentally affects this notion of equality of opportunity. Year after year, for the last 20 years in India, and this is not just a biased civil society organization, this is part of the National Achievement Survey also. Roughly 60% of all kids in India who are in class 5, and this is year after year for the last 20 years, cannot read a single sentence in English or their mother tongue or perform 2-digit or 3-digit arithmetic. Right? To quote one of the CEOs of one of India's largest education NGOs, Madhav Chavan of Pratham, they're basically creating a generation who are functionally illiterate. Right? They're not even able to, with time, learning outcomes improve. By the time you're in class 8, class 9, learning outcomes improve. But a large group of students just drop out of schooling also because they're just not able to read a damn thing or perform 2-digit arithmetic. So now, whoever has got into a decent higher education institution in India, if you are thinking that you are here because of your own hard work, there is a claim you can make. All of us want to be rewarded justly for our talent and for our effort. It is a fundamental organizing principle of our society, and that's a whole different debate. I have worked my butt off. I want some reward for it. I want validation for it. I want to be rewarded for it. So do you. So does everybody else. Now, that is one thing. But if many people are making the claim that I went to school, he also went to school, she also went to school, that marginalized oppressed caste person also went to school. We all went to school. We all got these marks. Why are they being privileged? It's very important to understand that this experiences of schooling are so diverse. The schooling is such a essentialized term that we don't have the same experiences. And in aggregate, we are understanding that very specific groups have had very good education, and many groups have not had education. So this entire meritocracy debate in India is a complete myth. There is no such thing in India at all. And I would happily challenge anybody based on this topic, based on not what happens in higher education, because I've not been in that zone for a very, very long time. In fact, I entered an Indian university yesterday, after like some 7-8 years. But I have been very closely rooted in schools for a very long time. And Ravikant has done phenomenal work on documenting the lived experiences of many oppressed caste people inside these institutions. And the hegemony and the tyranny of merit, to quote Michael Sandel, that upper caste students are exercising because they think they have had the same experiences and that they're taking some random advantage. But that's definitely not true, because they have probably had very good access to quality education and are assuming that a lot of other people have had access to the same schooling at all. Because the school, apart from a lot of functions it plays, it is one of the major functions it plays in society is it invisibilizes. It invisibilizes, and this is not a argument that I'm making. This is a very commonly understood framework in the sociology of education, that school education tends to transform natural advantages of privilege into educational advantages. And in that transformation process, there's an entire invisibilization that's happening. To give you an example, I'll give you my own example. Upper caste, man, able-bodied, English, let's take these 3 advantages. Over the course of my schooling and higher education, these advantages transformed themselves into educational advantages. I was able to go to Harvard. I was able to start a PhD in Cambridge. All like, yes, there is some element of hard work and talent. I won't take that away from myself, neither would I take it away from anybody else. But these advantages were basically transformed and invisibilized as I went through education. Right. And the school plays, as a civic institution, plays that role as an invisibilizer. And the school, this is also well documented, that the school plays the role of favoring the dominant group of society, because, and in this case in India, it is the middle class, because the middle class are dominant and not dominant, are universal and specific, all sorts of things. So in that itself, there is ambiguity, sort of creates dominance in that in its own way. And in various different ways, the school tends to favor those who have particular kinds of capital at the expense of those who, right? So, for example, I was doing an interview today morning for my fieldwork for PhD, and one parent was telling me that with the RTE now around, there are students from very poor marginalized backgrounds studying with very rich kids. Now, as a social experiment, theoretically, that's great. But what they told me, and I'm just quoting them, I don't actually know what's properly happening, is that these kids who are from, what this lady told me, from slums, are interacting with kids who are coming in Audis and BMWs. And this quote unquote local kid, threw a chalk at this girl, and then is coming and speaking in this local slang, and basically, to broadly consider, they're not able to gel. Who's benefiting and who's suffering over here? Right? The school is definitely benefiting and preferring those who are of a particular dominant position, and not and these children, sure, they may be able to, some of them may be able to reap the benefits of this kind of education, but we don't know what the socio-psychological harms that are happening to them continuously, right? So it is well established that, like, many schools tend to favor those who are in dominant positions at the expense of people from marginalized and oppressed backgrounds. So the idea of the school being a neutralizer of disadvantages, because we are mixing people together, is not true. Because if you look at many schools in India, they're very homogeneous in their setup. Right? Many private schools in India will have only upper class people. Many public schools in India will have very people from very marginalized backgrounds. So, but we call both of them schools, and we think again, marks play this role. Marks and exams play this role also. I get 100 in math. This person get 100 in math. We're supposedly the same. Again, that's what the number does. Also, the number invisibilizes. It essentializes and strips people of context and aspirations and stories. That's, yeah.
Especially, it's actually a very troubling factor, this how this aspects of cumulative advantage and disadvantage accumulate, right? I remember reading this study. I think you can give a reflection, which was done post COVID-19. I don't know in which country, but not in India, where if they have seen the education outcomes of the children post COVID and pre COVID, right? Those who have similar education outcomes pre COVID. There was a wider distinction post-COVID, and some students are performing better than others, and that's because of their access to digital technology or the parental education. I think these are all very invisible factors which peeps into it. So what do you think about it?
I said also, it's not just this, it's also, it still remains to be the case in India and many parts of the world. Who you are and what you will be is fundamentally determined by where you're born and who you're born to. Right? And we still, as a society, have not been able to come up or invent a civic institution that neutralizes that injustice. The school is perhaps has been our best bet, and it's not working. Which is why the subtitle of the book is The Politics of Education. Right? These are the politics of education. It is not about how good or bad schools are working. That's not what I'm good. I don't think I'm good at writing about that. That's like, economists do that brilliantly well. Many policymakers people trained in bureaucracy, etc., do that job a lot better. What is the politics? It's this: we are still not able to mitigate the circumstances in which people are born and where they're. And that's a fundamental that's a fundamental political question, and that's where it's at. At least that's how I think about it.
Yeah, now that we are talking about schooling, I would like to address another aspect which you wrote about how the schooling works as a system of indoctrination, right? To create the Indian identity and erase the traditional identities, right? And I think that goes a little bit along with the question of the aspiration of regional languages, right? Which would you reflect on it?
Well, I spoke. There's this chapter, one of the final chapters in the book is about having to write a history textbook and how history textbooks are always a nation-making project. It is a tool of the nation state. Um, so I spoke to multiple historians who I quote in the book, including Romila Thapar, who wrote the first NCERT CBSE textbook back in the 1960s and all of that. The idea always of a history textbook is to, help students think about themselves, help students think about their past and who they are in the present and how they want their societies to be. So it is always a tool of the nation state. What is happening now is very, very visible for all of us to see. Earlier, it was rather subversive. Now you are having whole elements whole elements of history being completely negated. Very random revisionist history is being written. And as these historians pointed out to me, it's happening at a time where no other time in Indian history have so many people been so interested in the past. So in one sense, I mean, you cannot remove I think indoctrination is a strong word when we're talking about history. In one sense, we cannot move the influential part of history education or of education in general, because education itself is a fundamentally political question. Because the first question is, what do I teach? If you, as a professor, are designing a course, or you as a teacher are like going to go teach something, the first question you're going to ask yourself is, what do I teach? The next question that follows is, how do I teach? Both of them are inherently political questions, because you are trying to impose some aspect of who you are, what you want students to learn, what you want the future to be, what you think is true, what you think is right. All of these things are automatically projected on in what you teach and how you teach. Right? So I wouldn't say that is an unjust thing. What matters, again, is the context in which this is happening. And what kind of students we want our learners, what kind of people we want our learners to be. And my experience of writing a history textbook for a school, a very radical Hindu-based school, was not a very pleasant experience, which I document also. But having said that, I would like, that's the thing, it's a much bigger notion than just the fact that particular elements of Indian history is being removed and being brought about by a very revisionist history that kind of helps the current government's agendas and all of that. That is happening for sure. And that needs to be, in some senses, condemned, in some senses, really criticized, looked upon a lot more seriously. But it's also important to note that the history textbook is a project of the nation state. It's much bigger than just one government's agenda. Every country in the world has a say in the way history textbooks are. That's an important qualifying factor.
I think the teacher clearly plays a role here, right? Now, while we both might agree upon the fact that there is a kind of a particular way of, I mean, as you have initially pointed out, the interest in the history is at highest ever before, and now when particular hegemonic ideas is taking place, right? I don't think there can be a neutrality, right? I think there should be a counter hegemonic sense in teaching, right? Um, this is one thing which I face in some of the classes where they ask me, so why are you not neutral, right? They say you're supposed to be neutral and give perspective, so we will figure out which one to go with. But I don't think there is a space for neutrality when we are living in a hegemony of particular kind of ideas at a larger scale. So what do you think?
Absolutely. No, I think the neutrality is as well documented by many good people is it's a tool of the oppressor, and there is no scope for neutrality in history. And whoever is like, they're like, I want the facts in history. I want teach me objectively. Don't give me your opinions or your bias. Fundamentally flawed opinion. It is impossible to not bring opinions and biases into history, because history does not exist in an objective realm. Neither do events in the world happen without intentions and ambitions of actors. And history is written by people. History does not jump out of the sky and come. If I think it's very interesting to read. If somebody I would recommend to read more on this, it would be to like for people to read Hegel, and how history kind of is a measure of how he understands history in the world today. It's I think it's an important context to kind of consider a lot more seriously. But yeah, there is no such. I firmly believe there is no such thing as objective history, and whoever claims that is just killing themselves for their is killing themselves, and is also working on projects to perpetuate their own darkness. That is very important to understand.
I thought I'll talk about your book in the end of the conversation, but I think we had a very fluid conversation. So I especially want to ask this question: what's the point, right? When you try to name your book as "What's the point?" you did not get the approach of the publisher, but then you decided for a different title. Can you explain the title? That's a very interesting one.
The title,
Yeah.
Yeah. So the title, even until like 2 months of the publication, the title was still was a vexing thing. Even the publishers weren't particularly keen on, but I was very keen. And I think it's intentionally a little provocative. The smart and the dumbs is also, it's a metaphor and a kind of this provocation towards understanding a much larger thing that's happening in Indian society today, and by extension in like multiple other societies in the world. Also, that in a neoliberal globalized world, and let me clarify what I mean by neoliberal, I don't just mean, like I said before, I don't just mean a valorization of monopoly, that like the Reliance, the GMRs, and the Adanis of the world, like whatever they're doing is significantly more efficient and effective than what the state can do. Nor is it like is it just favoring private investment over the state. Neither is it a commentary on that capitalism rocks and communism sucks, or like vice versa. It's also an understanding of the fact that neoliberalism has had an effect on the way we understand ourselves in society as these economic entrepreneurs who are capable of solving every issue by ourselves. And if we don't do these, if we are not that our successes are our own because of our hard work and talent. Our failures is our fault, right? So it's kind of intentionally work to erase structural context. At least a larger neoliberal globalization narrative, the discourse has kind of erased to some extent structural context from people's day-to-day lives and aspirations. And now the smart and the dumb also connects to Michael Sandel's work on the tyranny of merit, where he says the same thing also. Like, the tyranny of merit is that the people who are successful believe that they're successful because of their own doing, and those who fail deserve to do so. Right? And this is creating a whole host of problems in society, particularly perpetuating the rapid rise of very extremist right-wing governments across the world. Right? India and US are prime examples of it. Right? Because they're continuously telling people that whoever has not done well in life, and whatever doing well means, that they have deserved their fate. Right? So we're bringing again a very deterministic, fate-based argument in this entire thing. And what I try to point out with the title, The Smart and the Dumb, and it's directly taken from a quote of this white American political philosopher called Thomas Nagel, where he says, when the grave injustice of race and gender are solved, we'll still be left with the injustice of the smart and the dumb. Right? So the smart and the dumb is not just a material, this classification is not just a material injustice, it's also epistemic. That is, injustice done to you in the form of a Noah, injustice done to you in the form of a carrier and a bearer of knowledge, where your knowledge and your experiences are intentionally understood to be not important or not. And even if school education has the promise of solving particular injustices, material injustices, the way school education systems are currently structured, and rather the way education systems, broadly speaking, are constructed, it still classifies people into two categories: the smart, who are naturally against this, to quote this quote unquote, who are naturally smarter, who have this ideology of being gifted and they deserve their success, and the dumb who deserve to be left behind. Right? And of course, it's not my opinion that the dumb deserve to be left behind, but this is my point, like drawing upon all of these people who I just spoke about. This is what education is also doing. It is making people feel and evoking these emotions and evoking these very strong political affiliations in them. That they are smart. One group of people are smart and one group of people are not. And that was the idea of it. And my previous title of the book was What's the Point? That was rejected continuously because publishers felt it to be too defeated, like as if I'm asking, like, what's the point of education?
I still love your first title. What's the point, right? Even though the
I still very much stand by it. Yeah, but it's
yeah. Okay, one last question, which is completely reckless question. So, how to change the education system so that everybody gets an equal opportunity? It's a very reckless question, but I would like to know your larger reformation.
I've been asked this question also in a few other engagements for this book, and it goes back to everything that we've spoken about for the last hour or so. That if anything, we need to bring back education into a political discourse, remove the hegemony of the policy discourse, bring back people's aspirations, experiences, and stories, center it in I don't know how, but center it in politics. And by politics, I don't just mean electoral politics. I mean in discourses, in dinner table conversations, in in the way people interact with each other. And there needs to be a democratic dialogue on what the purposes of education are. Because currently, education is benefiting a group of people and severely affecting a group of people, while the larger veneer is that it's benefiting everyone. So that is the one thing. If there's one takeaway, that's one takeaway I would give.
So, Vishal Vasanthakumar, thank you so much for your time and thank you for being humble, patient, and frank in all the answers. Thank you so much.
This was very great question. That really had it made me reflect and think a lot about what I'm doing also. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.